At 32, the man who had conquered the largest empire the Greek world had ever seen lay dying in Babylon, unable to speak. Outside his chamber, the generals who had crossed Asia beside him filed past his bed. Some wept. Others were already calculating what would happen when he stopped breathing. History remembers him as Alexander the Great, the undefeated commander who shattered Persia and carried his army from Macedonia to India. But behind that title is a darker record. Cities destroyed, friends executed, soldiers driven through a desert that killed them by the thousands, and a king who increasingly demanded to be treated as more than human. Was Alexander a visionary building a new world? Or did absolute power slowly turn history's greatest conqueror into the prisoner of his own myth? Welcome to the History Ledger. Tonight we follow the evidence behind Alexander's transformation, from brilliant prince to isolated king, and the moment his conquest turned inward. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Macedonia. His father, Philip II, transformed the kingdom into a military power and forced most of Greece under his leadership. For Alexander, Philip was both teacher and rival. Raised on the Iliad, encouraged by his mother Olympias, and surrounded by legends of divine ancestry, Alexander grew up expecting a life larger than that of ordinary men. Philip's victories created Alexander's inheritance. They may also have created his deepest fear. According to Plutarch, when news arrived of another Macedonian success, the young prince complained that his father would leave him nothing great to accomplish. Whether the remark is literal or polished by a later biographer, it captures the rivalry that followed him throughout his life. Alexander did not merely need to succeed. He needed to surpass the man who had made his success possible. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated during a public celebration. The killer was Pausanias, one of his bodyguards. But questions about a wider conspiracy have never disappeared. Alexander was 20. He inherited a dangerous throne, hostile neighbors, and ambitious rivals who could interpret hesitation as weakness. He did not hesitate. Potential threats were removed. Revolts were crushed. Then, in 335 BCE, Thebes rebelled after hearing a false report that Alexander had died. The Macedonian response was devastating. The city fell. Thousands were killed, and ancient accounts say roughly 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. Later tradition claimed that Alexander spared temples and the house of the poet Pindar. Everything else became a warning. Imagine the message reaching Athens. One of Greece's most celebrated cities had resisted, and within days, its political existence was gone. Alexander had not yet invaded Persia, but he had already learned that terror could travel faster than an army. The following year, he crossed into Asia with an army created largely by his father. The invasion offered him wealth, legitimacy, and a stage vast enough to escape Philip's shadow. At the Granicus River, Alexander led a cavalry assault into a dangerous crossing and nearly died. Cleitus the Black, an experienced Macedonian officer, reportedly saved him by cutting down a Persian attacker. The episode established the pattern that made Alexander irresistible to his men. He did not command from safety. He entered the point of greatest danger and survived. Every survival strengthened the legend. After victories at Granicus and Issus, Alexander moved down the Mediterranean coast. Most cities submitted. Tyre did not. The island city was protected by walls and sea. For 7 months, Alexander's army built a causeway from the mainland while Tyrian defenders attacked from the walls and burned Macedonian siege equipment. Eventually, Alexander assembled a fleet, breached the defenses, and took the city in 332 BCE. The aftermath was brutal. Ancient sources describe mass killing and enslavement, although their precise figures must be treated cautiously. The strategic problem had been solved. The punishment ensured that the next city understood the cost of resistance. This was Alexander at his most formidable, imaginative, relentless, and willing to spend lives until geography itself surrendered. In Egypt, he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. He founded Alexandria and traveled across the desert to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa. What the priest told him is uncertain. Ancient accounts disagree even about the wording. But the visit became central to Alexander's image. He was associated with Zeus Ammon, and stories of divine parentage gained new force. Divine favor was politically useful. The danger was that performance and belief could become impossible to separate. In 331 BCE, Alexander faced Darius III near Gaugamela. The Persian army probably outnumbered his own, though the enormous totals given by ancient writers are not reliable. Alexander drew the Persian line out of position, opened a gap, and drove his cavalry toward Darius. The Persian king fled. The road to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis opened. He had achieved what his father had only planned. He was now master of the Persian Empire. But victory did not end the campaign. It removed the limit that had once defined it. At Persepolis, Alexander allowed his soldiers to plunder the city. Months later, fire consumed the palace complex. Ancient sources offer competing explanations. Some describe a deliberate act of revenge for the Persian destruction of Greek sanctuaries. Others place the decision during a drunken celebration and connect it to an Athenian woman named Thais. Modern historians still debate whether the burning was calculated, impulsive, or later regretted. Whatever the motive, the image is difficult to escape. Alexander stood inside the ceremonial heart of the empire he had conquered, while flames climbed its columns. He had defeated Persia, yet instead of returning home, he continued east. Darius was eventually killed by his own men. Alexander punished them and presented himself as the dead king's successor. He adopted Persian dress, recruited Iranian elites, and embraced parts of the court culture his Macedonians had invaded to destroy. Some accommodation was necessary, but to his veterans, the transformation felt like betrayal. Their Macedonian king was now testing proskinesis, an act of obeisance Greeks associated with submission before a god. The court became divided. Men who questioned Alexander's decisions could appear not merely critical, but disloyal. In 330 BCE, Philotas, commander of the Companion cavalry and son of the respected general Parmenion, was accused of failing to report a conspiracy. After interrogation and trial, Philotas was executed. Parmenion, hundreds of miles away and not given a chance to defend himself, was killed on Alexander's orders before news could reach him. Whatever Alexander feared, the message was clear. Decades of service could not protect a man once the king considered him dangerous. Then came the night that exposed what conquest had done to Alexander's inner circle. In 328 BCE, at Maracanda, Alexander and his companions were drinking at a banquet. Praise of the king turned into an argument. Cleitus, the officer credited with saving Alexander at the Granicus, defended the achievements of Philip and the old Macedonian army. He mocked Alexander's claims to divine status and condemned the humiliation of veteran officers. The room changed. Friends tried to pull Cleitus away. Alexander called for his guards. The argument continued. Cleitus returned and quoted a line suggesting that soldiers, not kings, earned victories with their blood. Alexander seized a weapon and killed him. For a few seconds, there was only the body of the man who had once saved his life. Ancient accounts say Alexander's rage collapsed into horror. He reportedly tried to turn the weapon on himself and spent days refusing food, calling Cleitus by name. Some details may have been dramatized by later writers, but the killing itself was real. It was more than a drunken tragedy. It revealed a court in which truth had become dangerous, and Alexander's temper had become lethal. The king could conquer cities. He could not undo one thrust of a spear. The campaign moved through Central Asia as suspicion tightened around the king. Callisthenes, the historian who opposed Proskinesis, was implicated in the Pages conspiracy and died in captivity. The evidence against him remains uncertain. In India, Alexander defeated King Porus at the Hydaspes River after a difficult crossing and a battle against war elephants. Impressed, he restored Porus as a ruler under Macedonian authority. It was also almost the end of his soldiers' obedience. At the Hephaestion River, Alexander ordered the army to continue east. The men refused. Beyond them were more kingdoms, more rivers, and reports of powerful armies. Behind them lay 8 years of campaigning and thousands of miles between the survivors and their homes. Alexander withdrew to his tent and waited. The army did not change its mind. The undefeated king had finally encountered an enemy he could not charge: the collective refusal of his own exhausted men. After several days, he agreed to turn back. But retreat did not mean safety. The return route crossed the Gedrosian desert. Heat, thirst, and failing supplies devastated the column. Ancient writers describe soldiers and camp followers collapsing in the sand. One famous account says soldiers offered Alexander a little water in a helmet. He poured it away rather than drink, while his armies suffered. The story may have been shaped to celebrate his leadership, but it reflects the bond that had once made men follow him anywhere. That bond now had a darker edge. Why choose such a route? Some historians have interpreted the march as punishment for the refusal at the Hephaestus. Others argue Alexander wanted to surpass legendary expeditions, support his fleet, or secure the empire's southern coast. His exact motive cannot be recovered. The result can: enormous loss during a journey that achieved little worthy of its cost. When Alexander reached the imperial heartland, he began reorganizing the empire and punishing officials accused of corruption. Then, in 324 BCE, Hephaestion died at Ecbatana. Hephaestion had been Alexander's closest companion since youth. His death produced grief on an imperial scale. Ancient sources report that Alexander cut his own hair, ordered mourning throughout the empire, and sought heroic honors for his friend. Some accounts add more extreme commands, but their details are difficult to verify. What is clear is that Hephaestion's death left Alexander more isolated than ever. Cleitus was dead by his hand. Parmenion and Philotas had been executed. Callisthenes had died in custody. The army had defied him. Now the companion who stood closest to the man behind the king was gone. Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BCE and planned new campaigns. Arabia may have been next. Then, after a period of feasting and drinking, he developed a fever. Over the following days, his condition worsened until he could no longer speak. His soldiers demanded to see him. They entered the chamber one by one, passing the bed of the commander they had followed across the known world. Alexander reportedly acknowledged them with his eyes. He died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, a month short of his 33rd birthday. The cause remains unknown. Disease is generally considered more plausible than the later rumors of poison. Later tradition claimed that when asked who should inherit the empire, Alexander answered, "To the strongest." We cannot know whether he said it, but the phrase perfectly describes what followed. He had named no clear adult successor. His half-brother had limited capacity to rule, and Roxanne's child had not yet been born. Alexander's generals divided commands, formed alliances, and went to war. The conflicts of the successors lasted for decades. Alexander's family was eliminated, and the empire he had built fractured into rival kingdoms. His conquests nevertheless transformed the ancient world. Greek language and culture spread across new regions, while Greek settlers encountered Egyptian, Persian, Central Asian, and Indian traditions. Cities bearing his name became centers of trade and learning. The Hellenistic age was not an illusion. Neither was its price. Thebes had been destroyed. Tyre had been slaughtered and enslaved. Persepolis had burned. Trusted officers died when loyalty became indistinguishable from obedience. In Gedrosia, soldiers who had survived Persia and India disappeared into the desert on the journey home. Alexander's greatness and brutality came from many of the same qualities: ambition, courage, strategic imagination, and a refusal to accept boundaries. Those qualities broke an empire and prevented him from knowing when to stop. So what is your verdict? Was Alexander a visionary who connected worlds, a tyrant consumed by his own legend, or both? Leave your answer in the comments. Subscribe for the next story buried beneath the official version of the past. Kings record their victories. The history ledger records the cost.